It is absolutely fundamental to discard the lens that are based in polarization and partisanship towards a particular camp in the Gulf crisis in order to fully comprehend what the open relations between the UAE and the Israel mean and how they have come about. Because the reality that is staring the region in the face is that the UAE-Israel relations is the result of decades of taboo breaking by all of the smaller Gulf states in particular. Whether it's Qatar in 1996 that embraced Israel in order to antagonize Saudi Arabia and invited the largest US military base in the region to point towards Saudi Arabia, whether it's Bahrain which invited Kushner to present his deal of the century, whether it's Oman that invited Netanyahu to say to the UAE, you may be getting close to Israel, but I can also have ties with Tel Aviv, so don't try it, or whether it's the UAE that has facilitated some sort of integration of Israel in the region, not just by these open ties, but also by brokering a historical meeting between Sudan's leader AbdulFattah Burhan and Netanyahu. In other words, a more holistic approach reveals that this is the result of a joint Gulf effort that has been in the works for decades in order for each of the smaller Gulf states to wield Israel as a weapon against its regional rivals. And this is the dynamic that ensures that Israel remains a strategic ally to these states. Because without any external power, without any external force, these smaller Gulf states are forced by geostrategic circumstances to align with one of the larger neighbors, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Egypt or Iran. They are forced to cooperate or forced to align with one of these neighbors. The only way they can pursue an entirely independent foreign policy is by bringing in an external protector who can protect from any backlash from any of these neighbors who might get angry at any foreign policy that is pursued at their expense. In other words, they agree to become a semi-vassal or a semi-protectorate by aligning with Israel and the US against Saudi Arabia, by aligning with Israel and the US against Egypt, by aligning with Israel and the US against Iran. This is the only way in which Gulf states are able to exert that independence between quotation marks. And that's the irony, that they can only pursue an independent foreign policy by becoming a semi-vassal and becoming a semi-protectorate. In other words, it is more favorable for these states that they invite the foreign protector and align with the foreign protector against their own kin, against their own neighbors, against their own interests in the region, which objectively rely on them cooperating and becoming an independent bloc in order to exert themselves against the US and against Israel, which continue to increase their demands for demonstration of loyalty. And this is the reality. This is the reality that is staring the region in the face. This is the dynamic that allows Israel to become a strategic ally. As long as the smaller Gulf states seek ambitions that are at the expense of their larger neighbors, Israel will continue to be a strategic ally. And this is why Allah says in the Quran, وَلَا تَنَازَعُوا فَتَفْشَلُوا وَتَذْهَبَ رِيحُكُمْ. And do not quarrel between one yourselves, otherwise you will become weak and your power will desert you. This is the epitome of what is going on in the region. There is only one situation in which Israel becomes irrelevant and no longer becomes a strategic ally, and that's if these ambitions against one another cease, and if a framework of political security and economic cooperation comes about which allows the Gulf to act as one bloc, an independent bloc, against the persistent demands of the US and Israel that nearly always are at the expense of any of the causes of the Muslim world.